It has certainly been a hot summer for many of us, and this week heat alerts by the U.S. National Weather Service will affect some 227 million people. Just this month, Scientific American noted that heat is the number one cause of weather-related death in the United States, and that in most years, heat-related deaths exceed deaths due to hurricanes, floods, and tornadoes combined. But of course, this isn't the first time that there's been a heat wave in America. Back in August of 1896, a heat wave with 10 days of record temperature struck the eastern United States. It was particularly deadly in cities that were full of crowded tenements. In New York City, the heat wave of 1896 killed hundreds of people and dramatically shifted the careers of two of the most notable political figures of the era. It is history that deserves to be remembered.
Edward Cohn, an assistant professor of American history at Bill Kent University, wrote in the summer 2008 edition of New York City Archives. According to death certificates filed in Manhattan on August 4th, the first victim of the heat wave may have been 15-month-old Hyman Goldman. Cohn notes that the toddler, whose family had only immigrated from Russia 9 months before, had already been suffering from what 19th century doctors called cholera infantium, a common diarrhea that afflicted children during the summer months, and was thus weakened when the heat wave struck. The doctors listed exhaustion as his cause of death. That was, Cohn explains, one of various euphemisms that doctors used to describe death due to the heat. Many infant deaths were caused by summer diarrhea or convulsions, while adults died from asthenia, exhaustion, thermic fever, heat stroke, sunstroke, and insolation, Cohn writes. The next day, the New York Times noted how hot it had been on the 4th. Another scorcher came yesterday with a high thermometer and over 90% humidity. The shady sides of the streets were eagerly sought and crowded by citizens who walked as slowly as their business would permit. The paper gave a list of people who had been prostrated in the city that day, including Patrick Murray, 59 years old, of 570 East 70th Street, who had been overcome by heat at 68th Street in the East River and had been taken to Flower Hospital. 22-year-old Italian laborer Michael Rawless had been overcome at work and taken to Manhattan Hospital, as had 35-year-old Andrew Sturgis. 65-year-old Annie Kelly was taken to New York Hospital, while 63-year-old Lurson Present had been taken to Governor Hospital. Still, many more people were hospitalized for heat prostration in Brooklyn. The lists that day were just a beginning. They would grow much larger over the next 2 weeks. Officially, the high was 87 degrees in the city on August 4th, with nearly 90% humidity. But Cohn notes the official temperature was recorded high above street level, at an elevation free of much of the radiation heat from brick, concrete, and asphalt, and able to catch at least some breeze. It was much hotter at street level, and even worse in the city's crowded tenements. National Public Radio noted in 2010, many thousands of people were crammed into tenements on the Lower East Side with no air conditioning, little circulating air, and no running water. Cohn wrote on the website History News Network, inside the brick and stone tenements of the Lower East Side, temperatures hit 120 degrees. Roasting alive, the city's working poor. And the record-setting heat was just beginning. On August 5th, a headline in the Brooklyn Daily Eagle read, "Forecaster Dunn says today may prove a record breaker." If weather forecaster Sergeant E.B. Dunn of the Weather Bureau's predictions are correct, today will be a record breaker so far as the heat is concerned, the paper reported. This will be the warmest day of the summer. He said this morning the highest point the thermometer has reached on any August 5th was 91 degrees in 1881, and I think by the way the day opened that it will go above that point today. The thermometer was 7 degrees higher at 8 this morning than it was at the same hour yesterday. The paper reported that it was hot throughout the eastern United States and that prostrations were numerous and outdoor work in a number of towns had to be suspended. The next day, in addition to the growing lists of people hospitalized prostrated by heat, the New York Times headline read, 4 deaths from heat. And still the heat wave continued. On the 6th, the Brooklyn Standard Union reported that today is cooler than yesterday, but the humidity is greater, however, and that makes everyone believe that it is hotter. The Brooklyn Daily Eagle headline on August 7th read, "No cooler weather in sight," reporting that the conditions for cooler weather are unfavorable. And on the 8th, the New York World lamented, "Today will be another scorcher," and forecaster Dunn can see no immediate change. Forecaster E.B. Dunn announced early in the day that there was nothing but hot waves in sight all over the country, and the best sweltering New York could hope for was the temporary relief afforded by thunder showers. The headline read, "Air Turned to Fire." The thermometer and the humidity gauge together proved yesterday the hottest day of the year, the paper reported. Factories shut down, gangs of laborers knocked off, clerks were excused from afternoon duty, and salesmen allowed 30 minutes out of every hour in which to cool off. Men died under the hot sun. More than 100 on Manhattan Island alone fell prostrate while at work and had to be carried to hospitals. Horses fell inside of water troughs, and many a poor dog, whose tongue hung from his mouth for want of drink, was shot on the suspicion of being mad. The paper noted the death of many horses as well, so much so that the Commissioner of Public Works was compelled to change the working hours of his department to avoid work at midday. The World listed more deaths. William Western was found dead in his room at number 5 Prince Street. He was 68 years old. The excessive heat is supposed to have killed him. Longshoreman Patrick Lohman was prostrated from heat at work and died later at his home. 32-year-old William Meehan was taken to St. Vincent Hospital with sunstroke and died there. An unknown man was taken to Fordham Hospital, unconscious from heat prostration, and never regained consciousness. There were still more deaths in Brooklyn. Cohn writes that the heat wave wore New Yorkers down, killed the old and young, rich and poor. It took a particular toll on the urban poor, especially laborers who literally worked themselves to death. The World reported that with the mercury as high as on Thursday, but with the percentage of humidity even higher, yesterday was the hottest and most unbearable day of the present heated term, and continued. Those who felt prostrated from the excessive heat are listed on the police and hospital records, but of the hundreds of thousands of others who kept their feet while wishing every minute that someone would come along and take them away to the waterside or to a marble slab, some of them felt that desperate, there is no official record. Cohn writes that, like the very young, the elderly were also at risk. Perhaps the heat wave's oldest victim was Catherine Clark, age 103, a widowed housewife who had immigrated from Ireland 63 years before. Her doctor made a point of noting on her death certificate that her hearing and sight and cheerfulness were fine when he last attended to her. Her cause of death, he wrote, was bronchitis and heat. But the heat caused more deaths than those listed. Cohn told National Public Radio it was so densely packed that most people couldn't even live inside the tenement itself. The streets in front of tenements and the rooftops and the fire escapes were filled with people all the time because there was no room for everyone to fit inside. They took to the rooftops and they took to the fire escapes, trying to catch a breath of fresh air. Inevitably, some would fall asleep or get drunk, roll off the top of a 5-story tenement, crash into the courtyard below, and be killed. You'd have children who would go to sleep on fire escapes and fall off and break their legs or be killed. People tried to go down to the piers on the East River and sleep there, out in the open, and would roll into the river and drown. Even those who managed to go without being prostrated suffered. The New York Times noted, the terrible heat wave, which has swept over the whole country recently, has affected many more persons than were reported in the daily press. There were few indeed who did not suffer in the large cities, particularly those whose occupations kept them in the heated air. On the 5th or 6th day of the existence of the wave, a torpor seemed to settle over all animate creation. Persons crept about dully and acted sluggish and stupid. A car conductor looked without intelligence at a passenger who asked him a question 3 times, then roused and, passing his hand over his forehead as if to brush some weight away, said, "Excuse me, ma'am, I don't seem to know what I'm doing today." He was dazed and stupefied by the unremitting heat, and so was the rest of the world. By the 11th, it was obvious that the city was in crisis. The New York Times reported that the days of death continue. The sun is still unwearied of scourging. The World reported a policeman fell dead while getting a glass of water for a prostrated woman. Another officer dropped at his post on Allen Street. A third died in a hospital last night. A fireman fell while crossing the street. A workman on a high building was sunstruck and rolled to the ground dead. Businessmen were stricken in their offices. Women fell to the floor while shopping. A driver fell off the seat of his truck, dead. All sorts and conditions of men are among the victims. Hospitals were overwhelmed. There weren't enough ambulances. To face the crisis, citizens took matters into their own hands. The World reports gangs of men went through the east side last night, opening every hydrant, from Houston to Division Street. East of the Bowery, every street was filled with running water. Half-naked men and women plunged into the hydrant streams. Children lay in water in the gutters. As the heat wave dragged on, it had an unexpected impact. On August 12th, at the height of the heat wave, William Jennings Bryan, newly nominated by the Democratic Party as its presidential candidate, gave a speech at Madison Square Garden. Cohn wrote on History News Network, Bryan arrived in New York at the height of the heat wave to officially accept the nomination at a massive rally in Madison Square Garden. That night, thousands packed into an overheated garden, prompting the New York Times to call it the most dangerous place in America. The Times reported that fans waved in all parts of the building in clouds, and in spite of them, it was sweltering hot. Cohn explains that an emergency hospital was set up in the basement to deal with the expected cases of heat stroke and exhaustion. But a further disaster did not occur for one simple reason. With the temperature inside the garden well over 100 degrees, and with Bryan deciding to dryly read his speech from a manuscript, thousands of New Yorkers simply left. The Times wrote, before he had been talking 5 minutes, people began to leave the garden. If the meeting is ever mentioned in history, it will be chiefly from the fact that for the first time in history, so far as the record shows, a presidential candidate has tried to talk to an audience that fled from him. Cohn continues. The next day, even sympathetic Democratic papers called the speech a failure, and Bryan's campaign managers canceled a further tour through New England. Perhaps never in American history has there been such a reversal of fortune for a presidential candidate within such a short time. If Bryan's political fortunes were dim, the prospects for another politician rose. National Public Radio notes that until the very last days of the crisis, the city government did very little to help its poorest residents survive the heat wave. The mayor didn't call an emergency meeting of his department heads until the very last day, and even then it was a little-known police commissioner named Theodore Roosevelt who championed the efforts to help New Yorkers survive the heat. Roosevelt wrote to his sister, "The heated term was the worst and most fatal we have ever known. The death rate trebled until it approached the ratio of a cholera epidemic. The horses died by the hundreds, so that it was impossible to remove their carcasses, and they added a genuine flavor of pestilence. And we had to distribute hundreds of tons of ice from the station houses to the people of the poorer precincts." The website Untapped New York writes that in a time frame before the invention of air conditioning, ice was an essential commodity during the summer to keep the body cool. To provide relief to the public, Roosevelt proposed that ice should be distributed across the city for free. Cohn told NPR, "Roosevelt is the one who champions the idea of the city giving away free ice to the poorest people living on the Lower East Side, and he personally supervises the distribution of ice. And after the ice was distributed, Roosevelt took it upon himself to tour the back alleys of some of the worst tenement districts in the United States to see how people were using the ice. So Roosevelt witnessed firsthand how immigrant fathers would chip off ice and give it to their children to suck on. I can't think how many American presidents have had such an intimate contact with the urban poor." Roosevelt endeared himself to the Republican Party, while Bryan failed to gain traction in New England. Bryan would lose to Republican William McKinley in November. 4 years later, when McKinley was nominated again, Theodore Roosevelt was nominated as his vice president.
As many as 100 more New Yorkers died on August 14th, but the spell was finally broken. By the 15th, the New York World was reporting that the torrid spell was broken for good, and that forecaster Dunn says that endurable weather can be expected from now on. The World reported a terrible 612 death toll for the New York City heat wave, but that is certainly well understated. Cohn notes that if you compare death between August 4th and 14th from previous years, it's clear that the New York City heat wave of 1896 killed as many as 1,500 people, which is, he notes, more than those killed in the New York City draft riots of 1863 and the Great Fire of Chicago in 1871 combined. Still, because heat waves uncover so slowly, he notes that the New York City heat wave of 1896 remains one of the least chronicled urban natural disasters in American history. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.